In 2023-17, climbers kicked the bucket on Everest 9, of which occur in May alone. Today, we will zero in on two of these climbers, both at various stages in life, yet on the mountain simultaneously. This is their story in the past, the assumption when you endeavored an Everest. Culmination was that you were a solid, independent climber with experience that could deal with most circumstances anyway. As of late, we plainly see that at times this is as of now false. Rather, outsider undertaking organizations can promote their Everest trips by requiring next to zero insight, as they will direct you bit by bit to the highest point for however long they are generously compensated. Obviously, the motivations behind why this is perilous are very clear, as an ever-increasing number of unpracticed climbers endeavor to culmination Everest. This has surely prompted debate developing locally, and there could be no greater model than 59-year-old Indian instructor Suzanne Leopoldino Jesus, with record-breaking climbing licenses. Conceded for undertaking Suzanne, a piece of the glacial mass Himalayan journey would go to Nepal, and from that point, Everest headquarters toward the beginning of May camp would be occupied most definitely, as there were north of 47 distinct groups, generally attempting to arrive at the top. Commonly, culmination offers must be shared across different undertakings, as the weather conditions will just allow a couple of good days at high heights, which naturally makes long queues develop in different areas. The weather conditions in May vacillated enormously. On Everest, however, the circumstances would somewhat work on. As the month went on, the temperature would float around 27 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 degrees Celsius, and there would be stray tempests that brought snowfall, adding to the gamble of torrential slides. Perceivability was perfect on the off chance that it was not snowing, and these future the times that climbers needed to make the most of in anticipation of her culmination. Bid Suzanne, like most climbers, would start with the climatization trips, which comprises of going to a higher height guide, resting and permitting your body to become used to these circumstances prior to getting once again into your beginning area. Typically, this is rehashed on numerous occasions and isn't just utilized full for climbers, yet it is likewise useful to give data to the Endeavour chiefs on a climatization trip. Sherpas can see firsthand the way in which clients will answer in various circumstances, and most would agree that there were very concerning finishes paperwork for Suzanne. Joined by a Sherpa in the primary 7-day stretch of May, they would go on their most memorable acclimatization outing, yet wouldn't make it far, as Suzanne battled to make it past Crompton Point, an area 250 meters above Everest headquarters. Ordinarily, it would take an accomplished mountain dweller 20 minutes to arrive at this area. Anyway, it took Suzanne more than 5 hours on her most memorable attempt. Not having any desire to surrender, she would endeavor to cross once more a couple of days after the fact, yet this time it would require her 6 hours. Turned out to be obvious to the Sherpas that Suzanne wouldn't be fit to climb Everest. They were straightforward with her and intensely cautioned against going on. However, she wouldn't tune in. At the age of 15-9, Suzanne had a fantasy about turning into the primary Asian lady to culmination Everest with a pacemaker who might express that she needed to climb the top, as the charge for obtaining consent had previously been settled completely. There is no record of Suzanne having any getting over experience, other than getting affirmation that she finished an Everest headquarters climb the prior year in 2022, functioning as an educator in one of the biggest government's schools in Silvassa, India. It seems like she drove an exceptionally ordinary way of life. Suzanne was not excessively dynamic, and it is clear she didn't have the essential experience for a mountain like Everest. In spite of this, the 59-year-old educator wouldn't take no for a response and would partake in her third acclimation trip during the second 7-day stretch of May. It began toward the beginning of the day. There were a couple of mists, yet not really troubling. Our own would tick by as the burned by the sun over them, getting across the sky. Each step You could hear the mash-off. White extraordinary snow, under boots when they had arrived at Crompton Point 12 hours, had passed 6 hours more slow than her past time, and by a long shot the most horrendously terrible time, yet a very disturbing sign was that Suzanne was not showing any advancement. Truth be told, a remarkable inverse each endeavor here. Times have expanded, showing she was not improving, but instead declining after this excursion. Suzanne detailed issues with her throat and expressed that she found it extremely testing to swallow food. On top of that, she had begun to foster a cold and was starting to feel debilitated. It was obvious to her Sherpa a more straightforward methodology was required, and subsequently they had a discussion where Suzanne was told in exactly the same words that assuming she proceeded with, she would pass on it. Difficult to comprehend what was going through her head as of now. Regardless of being told such a frightening idea, and against all exhortation given to her, she would not set in stone to climb Everest at any expense. Tragically, right now, Suzanne was turning into a danger to herself, as well as to everyone around her. Too, her condition quickly weakened as the disorder was turning out to be more regrettable. Every day Suzanne would start her Everest endeavor on May 17th. Yet there was not a lot to be said about this, as she would just make it 500 meters above her headquarters. Prior to halting, the Sherpa with Suzanne had sufficiently seen and unequivocally against her desires brought in a helicopter to have her emptied. Despite the fact that she had not gained a lot of headway, her condition had gotten so terrible she can never again descend from their area. When the helicopter showed up, Suzanne would not go, and Tayawi must be effectively gotten rid of from the mountain. She was in an awful state. They flew her straightforwardly to Lukla, a humble community in northeastern Nepal, for clinical help, where she would get care. The entire evening, yet sadly at 5 am on May 18th, was articulated dead. Her body would be moved to Kathmandu for an examination to additionally advance more, and from that point family would assume control over this. Story is really extraordinary in light of the fact that in the past seasons on Everest there couldn't ever have been an unpracticed climber like Suzanne. Being the tallest mountain on the planet, many gander at it as some kind of challenge, a crate on a piece of paper that can be verified by a pencil. Yet in the event that you don't view the mountain in a serious way, it's anything but a question of assuming a comparable story like Suzanne's will happen. It's just a matter of when. Music. It was hard for Malaysian climber Agnes Gandar Receptacle and Punyakub to conceal his fervor as he showed up at Everest headquarters toward the beginning of May. Initially from Kampung Benoni Papa Sabah, he filled in as a Malaysian cop and carried on with a somewhat dynamic way of life. The 55-year-old was a family man with a caring spouse and 6 youngsters, who he had a favorable opinion of. After work, a large portion of Jacob's time was spent effectively playing with his children, and on extraordinary events, he would be seen carrying a kid to work with him. Jacob surely carried on with a sound way of life, perhaps more so than your typical individual, yet his significant mountaineering experience was exceptionally restricted. He had endeavored to ascend Everest previously, yet was ineffective. Jacob was a known outrageous games fan, yet not especially for getting over, more so scuba plunging and dropping, whether for the test or simply the experience. Jacob went to Everest, where he would join the Nepali Trailblazer Undertakings campaign. When they showed up, the group started acclamation, gets over where, in spite of his age, Jacob had the option to do well. He surely was not the quickest, yet could stand his ground, and the Sherpas were not excessively worried about him endeavoring for the culmination anyway. The weather conditions changed quickly during the initial 14 days of May, as a major tempest would crawl on the mountain. A few days were spent doing the essential arrangements and acclimation trips, while on different days perceivability would be poor to the point that you were fortunate to finish anything. Jacob gave his all to become familiar with the circumstances, where he looked on normal -2 degrees Celsius or 27 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures After the underlying 14 days, the acclimation trips were done, and the group was at long last planning for the culmination push. The weather conditions would clear around May 15, and numerous campaigns would make use and begin their trips. Every climber must be kind of one another, as the space is restricted, particularly the higher up you climb. The Trailblazer Experience's group would start their move, at the time also following the well-known Southbring course. Over the course of the following couple of days, they made consistent progress up the mountain. The sky remained clear with the exception of a wanderer drifting cloud, and the splendid sunbeams bobbed off the snow onto Jacob's face. His breathing developed weighty as he got over increasingly high. On May 18th, just before the sunset, they had arrived at the area of Camp 4, close to 80 meters. Stacks of junk and void oxygen bottles were left dissipated on the ground, baffling every one of the climbers that saw this. Yet there was little they could by and by do to fix the issue. The development of garbage being left over from every one of the various endeavors on Everest is a developing issue that isn't being tended to well. The most affected regions are clearly headquarters and, shockingly, the higher height camps, yet there have been late reports of garbage being tossed into chasms, as it is a simpler arrangement than cutting it down the mountain. Jacob and the group got comfortable for the evening and got some genuinely necessary rest, as they had an important day in front of them. On May 19th, they got up before the sun had ascended overhead, as the expectation of the gathering was consistently constructing. Today was the day for their culmination push. They began their trip. However, it was not some time before the gathering saw something was the matter with Jacob. His advancement was increasingly slow. Expected to enjoy more reprieves, yet this was a sad, stressing sign, and really checked out in light of the fact that they were all the way into the demise zone. This simply intends that over a specific point in elevation, around 80 meters, is where the degree of oxygen is deficient to support human existence for a significant time frame length, in spite of not feeling too as he could. Jacob would continue to move for a really long time, until he in the end arrived at the south culmination, a well-known area for climbers to rest. Now the south culmination of Everest is around 130 meters from the authority culmination. However, to arrive at it, you need to descend around 11 meters from that point. Do the molding cross, which is a solitary edge sitting on a high elevation point between different sides that numerous climbers need to navigate, followed by giving the renowned Hillary step. And to the authority culmination, the sun was straight above him, yet Jacob couldn't track down the solidarity to move. He's ending up being handily confounded, and turned out to be obvious to people around him that he was creating elevation disorder. The Sherpas and team individuals around him perceived that they expected to move quickly to allow Jacob the best opportunity of endurance. Tragically, to cut somebody down the mountain from the passing zone is extremely precarious, and various Sherpas must be involved, which required some investment to coordinate. Yet after about an hour, they were all set and started plunging. The objective was to arrive at Camp 4 as quick as conceivable and get Jacob out of the demise zone. Each step they moved increasingly close to somewhere safe and secure. It was a test of skill and endurance. As the Sherpas kept on conveying Jacob down the mountain, they would mind him from time to time. However, prior to arriving at Camp 4, he would become lethargic. Sadly, he could never return and was articulated dead on Everest. His body would be left someplace in the South Col locale, where it was recovered the following day. His family would get the body back in Malaysia, where he currently rests in his old neighborhood. Suzanne and Jacob were two totally various people, however, both with fantasies about getting over the tallest mountain on the planet. Yet they kicked the bucket just a day, separated. Their accounts really feature their developing worries in the mountaineering local area of how much allows conceded and who they are being conceded to. There is no question that more guidelines are required. Yet by the day's end cash talks, the most intense, unfamiliar